I'd like to start by a short prayer for the technology gods. Please join me. Thank you, technology gods, for all that you offer when you're in a good mood. So what is happiness? Happiness is reflection, connection, and contact. Happiness is communication. Happiness is reciprocal and shared. In the early 70s, as a young artist, I began to examine mind and thought through painting. I used the first three letters of the words for air, fire, and water in Hebrew. The three letters are called Aleph, Mem, Shin, and are known as the mother letters. I wove them together to form this image. So I went deeper into the center of my mind by visualizing it, and then even deeper to where DNA is, and even deeper, and wherever I looked, the deeper I went, I always found that there had to be a relationship between two. Yes, there had to be a relationship of at least two in order to stimulate life, growth, and energy. When I painted reflections of events in time, I realized that any time DNA crossed, it revealed the Hebrew letter Aleph, which is the first letter in the alphabet, which is where the word alphabet comes from. And that denotes origin, source, and life. And so I'd found a wedding of mysticism and science. From childhood, nature had been my refuge. And in 1981, I began long solitary sojourns in nature that deeply affected my art and also my ideas about happiness. I found myself at a pond in Southern California. And for 3 years, I painted the pond in different times of day and night and different weather. And I became fascinated with these patterns as the reeds broke across the pond. And I saw continuous examples of an X, an angle, an arc, a straight line. And it seemed to me that there was some kind of calligraphic message that was inscribed in the landscape for me. I became very seduced by this calligraphy. I couldn't quite figure it out, but I knew that I would eventually. And the longer I stayed in the pond, however, I became more entranced with the reflection than with what was reflected. I again looked at the nature of reality. Was it the stick, or the reflection, or the floating leaves, or that which was reflected? I felt like an untethered soul, floating in this incredibly deep environment. I got deeper into myself, in this aqueous, luminous environment. And soon I realized that the floating leaves were marking the place where heaven meets earth, as above, so below, and similarly, that the floating leaves also marked behavior between individuals. I began to examine land with the same scrutiny that I examined the pond. And as I walked the magical forest in northern Canada, I was guided by the hand of nature. And I began to see illuminated incidents in life that reminded me of human experience, like being naked. Here, this pine tree has been stripped naked of its bark by a hungry elk. And I saw veiled contact. And contact. In the windows they bend as one, allegory of marriage. Aging together. Grief, heartbreak, dignity, the spirit in the tree, and learning to fly in the forest. I learned that form evokes feeling, and feeling conjures metaphor, and metaphor demands expression. As I scrutinized the land, I saw the same forms that I'd seen at the pond: the random crossing of sticks, the X, the angle, the triangle, the arc, the line. And as I walked around the world from the Himalayas to the beach, I began to see the patterns over and over again. And things that became symbols in so many cultures, like the tree of life, and that which has come to denote romantic love. I saw man, woman, animals. Nature had become supernatural. I also saw letters, or things that reminded me of letters. And because I read several languages and several alphabets, I was beginning to see patterns, the kind of patterns I had seen at the pond. It seemed like I was reading the ground, like the Chinese ideogram of roof over person, and the English letter A. I walked around the landscape with this chart of ancient alphabets, and in the far corner column, which is 4,000 years old, I recognized that the forms that I had been reading in the landscape were identical to the earliest forms of all alphabets. I collected groups of letter forms as well. And much like a child learning to read, I began to read words as I found them in the landscape, including the word for letter, made of the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet, high in the mountains of the Rockies. The first and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet create the word ot, which means letter. I isolated 5 forms of alphabetic morphology. I called the theory cosmography. And I realized, why did these forms jump out at me? And I figured that as our early ancestors roamed about their terrain, no matter where they were in the world, these same forms jumped out at them. And the reason that they did that was that they are mirrors of the neurons and the neural processes of perception and cognition. It was no surprise then that the first form of the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet was identical to the first form of the Hebrew alphabet, which is identical to DNA, photographed by Rosalind Franklin in 1952. We universally recognize external forms in the same way because they reflect our hardwired perceptual apparatus. We give meaning in cultural context. I wonder, do we see because of what we think, or do we think because of what we see? In the West, everybody knows that if a man or a woman is given an erotic image, they will have a psychophysiological affect. In the East, this kind of erotic image is part of a wholeness meditation. It isn't a separated quality. Much like the image becomes powerful as a healer for Navajos who create sand paintings, and the patient lies down on the sand painting and absorbs the images of the culture which are known to make him well. Similarly, Tibetans will meditate on a mandala to achieve wholeness. And sacred dance is practiced in most cultures worldwide in order to achieve a sense of wholeness and get together with all of the emotions so that they are not separated, but a fullness of personality is brought forward. Seeing sacred figures in different cultures will bring a certain sense of psychophysiological wholeness to those members of the lineage that revere those figures. And architecture also causes a psychophysiological change. The extruded mandala of this beautiful temple will cause an effect in our bodies as we move around them, as we do when we identify with our bodies to the abstract body of the Buddha in the Chorten. And we see that that origin becomes architecture that has strong physiological affect. We feel whole and peace and calm in this kind of setting, even in contemporary architecture. Our bodies are reflected in that way. While external forms are experienced consistently, belief systems are random, contextual, and convenient. Joy is culturally determined, but grief is experienced universally in the same way. In some cultures, one wants many husbands and another many wives, one wants sons, another wants daughters, sexual preference changes, and the gods change every 5 kilometers. But grief is universally felt in the same way, and that has to do with loss of contact, rejection, and abandonment. While cultures vary widely, we are fundamentally more alike than we are different. I spent 16 months alone in a high mountain forest. I lived with the big animals. And as the seasons changed, I once again saw the encryption in the landscape. And when winter came, I felt the separation from my tribe, because I had learned from the animals that we humans are also herding animals. It is only within the herd that we can be heard. I was invited to be present when the Dalai Lama gave the first Tantric Bodhicitta teaching in Dharamsala. We were instructed to visualize tigles, or white spheres, vital essences, which are 2 types, absolute and relative. Each of these tigles, these spheres, embodies boundless love, boundless compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And we were instructed to visualize the sphere, the bodhicitta sphere, start at the crown chakra and work its way down one side of the body, nourishing all the cells, systems, organs, accompanied by mudra and mantra, and then coming up the other side, nourishing the other side, and then out to nourish all sentient beings. Form, thought, belief, and behavior change psychophysiology. Positive visualization nourishes body, speech, and mind. When you feel better, you're kinder, you're more compassionate, you're other-directed, you're reflective. These are ingredients of happiness. In the East, we heal through meditation, and in the West, through medication. Only 2 letters distinguish one from the other. And so I put them together, and I like to think about the tender care, the space between, the grace between, the healer and the healee. Having learned that recognition is hardwired in our bodies, I believe that a model of contact and communication is submerged in our deepest recesses. I began to study cell behavior, a discernible unit of life living in groups as do animals and humans. I learned that healthy cells whisper together through their cell membranes. And I show you here cells who are right now separated by a soliton electromagnetic field. Here is the soliton. When calcium is present, and it must be present, the cells get together and have a wonderful party. But when calcium is not present, they can't cross the soliton. And so they begin to clone themselves, and this is what we call cancer. Similarly, sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, when they're working well together, spoon each other and create, and in their overlapping, create a sense of the DNA. But when they're not working well together, they lie separated, non-contacting, alone. In isolation, we may develop psychopathology. If we mirror ourselves, we're narcissists. If we're physically isolated, we talk to ourselves. And if we're emotionally isolated, We create multiple personalities, which is a mental form of cancer. Much like our hardwired physiological systems, our emotional search from birth is for a resonating reflection, not a clone. Micro to macro, all healthy organisms require reflection, communication, from particles to galaxies. We look for congruency, harmonious difference like a musical chord, which promotes healthy growth. The well-intentioned rub of stimulation animates emotional and behavioral evolution. In the 90s, I began a diamond series. I had these canvases made in that form, and soon I began to see white spheres appear. I talk about the fact that I began to see because the image drives itself. I have very little control over the image. I didn't know what the white spheres referred to, but in June of 1999, I suffered an almost lethal accident on a very remote island in the Pacific, which was the home of the Haida and Kwakiutl Indians for 15,000 years. I was found just about dead, and when I came back into consciousness, I began immediately to visualize all my cells, systems, and organs moving toward optimal health. I discovered that I had broken all my ribs, my sternum, my scapula on both sides, 4 vertebrae, crushed knee, crushed heart, crushed head, and 5 millimeters of bone fragments in my spinal column. The prognosis was awful. But I continued to work with the visualization, and 2 months later, when I began to walk, I had these very large canvases made, 7 feet tall, and began to reconstruct my body from the inside out. And I worked first on the spinal column, and I worked on the DNA and the cells and the ribs and the spirit. And as I worked this painting, these spheres appeared, and they appeared in this very distinct pattern. And I wondered, well, perhaps it had to do with the bodhicitta visualization, that pattern that had been instructed as the bodhicitta, the compassion, was moved through the body and out to others. Or perhaps it had to do with my idea that calcium was important for the speaking together of cells. And it was at that time that I did a little more research and discovered that calcium had in fact been part of the origin of the bodhicitta practice. The paintings were becoming medicine paintings. And the same pattern was used in acupuncture points and moxibustion points, as well as in the Western system, morphage in the lymphatic system. So as I created these paintings, they were healing me, and it was a reflected system where the image has the power of healing. I still had to get to those 5 millimeters of bone fragments in the spinal column, and so visually I created an open heart surgery. And I wound one of my names, meaning refuge, around the spinal column. And then there was no more problem with the bone fragments. As I got stronger, I felt that all my power had reached into my heart, and that I was once again able to look at images beyond myself, back into the beauty of nature, and that the rays of power could now extend throughout the universe. I felt tremendous gratitude and enormous grace to be given this life in which I could help others. I understood the intimacy of total interdependence. The spheres embodied evolutionary behavior, reflection, communication, compassion and justice, interdependence, health and well-being, all toward the greater good. I understood that happiness resides in the spaces between particles, between healer and patient, between breaths, between image and viewer. Each time we take a breath, we have a choice to take another and stay here and help others. Once we understand cause and effect and consequence, we become the deities, as divinity is in humanity and spirituality is in behavior. The deeper we understand the nature of interdependence, and the more profoundly we understand the nature of reflection, the closer we come. to wholeness. And with that, we get to clarity. And through that, we get to freedom, unity, and happiness.